Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, my guest is Dan Armstrong. Dan returns to talk about the work of Mauro Baglino and Pierre Sabak and his research of the work of the latter two, his interpretation of them, which I think will be very interesting because coming from an experiencer standpoint, like Dan's coming from, and then giving his insight about the work of these two, I thought it would be important to bring that information out now. So without any further ado, Dan, welcome to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
Thanks again, James. It's great to be here.
Likewise, yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I want to stress to the audience, like some of the sources for ancient historical figures, Alexander the Great, his father Philip the Great, or just Philip, we have very few sources to go on. And yet we have this large corpus of material about Alexander and his father. And there are large gaps in the sources. And sometimes the sources, the ancient chroniclers, didn't see fit to record something. It just was of no interest to them. Most of the early chroniclers of Alexander, for example, were Athenian, and a lot of them didn't like Philip and Alexander. So they purposely omitted to, leave out whole years of their lives. So historians have had to piece things together and make a lot of inferences. Okay, the reason I bring this up is it's taken for granted that Alexander and Philip are real historical figures because we know from the record that they did other things. Alexander set up a bunch of cities he named after himself, et cetera, et cetera. Point being is we don't have such a problem with the sources that Mauro Buglino and Pierre Sabak draw from. There are voluminous sources from the ancient world in a number of languages telling us about these beings, the Watchers, the Archons. They go by different names, but they describe this kind of confederation or alliance of different beings that have ruled over humanity since time immemorial. So I want to make that clear, okay? Not so many sources on Alexander, but we have all these books written about him, taken for granted Alexander was a real person. Some of the sources, the primary sources, were writing about Alexander centuries after Alexander died, okay? What we're talking about with the information that Daniel is going to share with us, this is information collated from a number of sources around the world in a number of different languages. And we can extrapolate that and talk about what the Mayans knew, what the Aztecs knew, what the Native Americans knew. Okay, but we're going to stick to what Mauro Buglino and Pierre Sabak have done because that's plenty enough material as it is. So, Daniel, take us through the whole process and how you came across the information of these two gentlemen and how it impacted you.
Yeah, thank you, James. Um, well, I came across Pierre's work a few years ago, and when I did, I was just beside myself because it was sort of like somebody did all this incredible work you could never in many lifetimes. And after watching a lot of his videos, I realized I just had to buy the book. It was just too much to follow not having that aid. And even when you have the book, you tend to reread and jump around a lot because there's a whole language that gets developed with it, the different concepts. Um, a year ago, after probably studying holographic culture for a year, I came across I was trying to do a little bit more digging on some of the ideas contained in the book, and I came across some interesting artifacts, and I decided to do a symbolic analysis because it was just sort of standing out to me, these artifacts, what the symbolism, what it was pertaining to as it was relating to what Pierre was arguing in his book. And I thought, well, this is great because this is actually proof of sorts about what he's talking about. It's not just a bunch of word games. There are specific symbols and signifiers that are referencing each other that have been carried down through time. And I think it makes it very exciting because it gets us away from the Roswell is the start of everything narrative. And when we can go back 2,000 years in history and see that we're having the same narrative about genetic engineering of humanity with another species, et cetera, and this is being done in those artifacts, we know that this isn't just some casual interpretation.
Yes, please
So,
continue.
yeah. So maybe just best to into it, but I've been watching a lot on Morrow's and Paul Wallace's work and their explanation. And there's the correspondences, and you know, and I'm sure you know a lot too with it. So we just sort of jump through and see what we can get. The first thing I wanted to start with is I'm going to have to switch my windows for a
Oh,
moment.
it's
So
quite all right.
excuse me. Yeah, I thought I would start with this Parabiago plate. And
Yeah, there it is.
great,
Oh, nice.
awesome. So as you can see, just to begin with, a beautiful object. So what started me on this, talking about this group called the Rechabites. It's a Judaic cult, part of a saucer cult, and he sort of walks you through the how that works. But basically, the Rechabites, Rechab in Hebrew means a four-horse drawn chariot.
Mm,
Okay, so that's sort of like and the main symbol I'm starting with, and you can see that here. Here we don't have horses, but you'll see that there are lions
yes.
being used. Okay, and the different ones as it relates. So we have these Rechabites. They're sort of charged with a secret by Yahweh. And basically what Pierre gets into is how it's basically a flying saucer that they're in charge of and how that relates to the temple. And Rechabites is from the Hebrew Rechab, like I was saying, a variant on the Arabic noun Rakeb, a chariot. And Rakeb parallels the Arabic edenim Rakib, a guardian, a watcher, or observer.
Mm,
And there's a relationship between so there's this sort of secret cult that understands about the mysteries, the UFO cult, if we want to call it that. So he talks about you have the Sali, which are the Romans, the Rechabites, which are done by the Jews, uh, Plato, the school of Plato, Pythagoras is the Greek or Hellen, and then you have the Rosicrucians, which are the German. And so there's this continuity of the secret carried through the different ages. What do you see that just sort of stands out to you a little bit in this plate?
well, the first thing that jumps out is the caduceus, or the serpent coiled around the plinth, or that structure that
Yeah,
points upwards. That, yes, that
yeah.
just,
And then we're going to see through when I'll try to do this one as quickly as possible because I'm sort of setting this one up first,
yeah.
and then we'll look at the Brandenburg Gate and the bas relief there. I'm looking at how the symbolism correlates, and we start to get an interesting picture going on. But yeah, that one is really in your face, as you said. So bear in mind, this is from considered about the 4th century, approximately, this plate. Okay, so it's beautiful. It was discovered near Milan, the beginning of the 20th century. So the way that I usually start with this is if we go through the works of Pierre, he talks a lot about the neophyte or the newly planted, as being representational of this seed, this panspermia, uh, when we're talking about the genetic engineering. And we see that there's the whole there's the corn here represented on the side, and he talks about how that's related to the word Dagon, and Dagon is like we know from Dogon, and this relates to Sirius. Okay, so we have the symbol of Sirius here, and we have a shield or a plate. So that's important as well. It's one of the symbols that will be repeated a lot throughout this, what Pierre calls the Ophanum wheels. So we have the neophyte here, and of course the entire scene is very sexual. And I can get into the detail about this, but the symbols tend to jump around and re-reference each other. We'll see that there are these beings, and a big one that I want to point out is how Pierre makes a distinction in showing that we have these two classes of angels, basically, the seraphim and the cherubim, right? And the seraphim being the ones that we would represent more by the snake or reptile, and coming from Sirius, and the cherubim being more of more human type angel that's often represented by the diminutive little childlike angels that we often call cherubs. And he says that basically they're generally represented by the Pleiades. We always see these two figures, and that's really important when we're doing this analysis. If we jump over to here for a second, you'll notice that the woman here is called Tellus. She's sort of, it's like a representation of Gaia. And like all of these things, there tends to be the gods overlap each other a lot in terms of who they are and what they're representing. But if you see her here, you notice that there's a snake weaving around her arm and the cornucopia coming from it. And it almost looks, if you sort of follow it, it almost looks like her arm is part of the snake at one point as well. So it's sort of making that illusion that they're conjoined. Of course, she has the cherub right next to her. So what we're looking at and what Pierre's arguing is how we have the cherubim and the seraphim are joined to create the Adamic man, right? So this model of human being, and specifically a model of human being that would be sexually compatible with the seraphim, right? If we go up the cornucopia for a second, you see that the snake is touching grapes. And the grape here, of course, is highly symbolic because the grape is related to the relationship of a hosted species. So the grape sort of grafts itself onto a vine. So this grafting is what we're looking at as our first clue about the genetic editing. We have, and Pierre lays this out nicely. So you have, on one hand, you have the word divine, D-I, and then hyphenate it with vine, right? When we're talking about the divine, then you have the vine, right? That the grape comes from, the vine. And then you have wine, which is what the Holy Communion is, and the consumption of, when you look at it, the host, right? And the host being the victim in this situation, and also representational of the blood. It's quite powerful when you see that a snake is biting the grapes here, which the cherub is leaning his hand onto as well, the same bunch of grapes. And I would argue that the cornucopia itself is sort of showing this stitched nature as well as the bounty and fertility that's involved with it.
Well, just a very quick observation. I see that you zoomed in to see the little childlike character on top of the
Yeah,
cornucopia.
yeah.
Just to the left of that being, you see what seems to be a lizard or a salamander, and then right next to that is a grasshopper, which is related in some
Yeah,
way to the mantis beings or the insectoids. So anyway, that's just something that jumps out at me. Interesting that would wind up on this
exactly.
relief.
Precisely. And it's actually, when you keep digging through this relief, you see that it's all referencing the same theme over and over and over again, just in a multitude of ways. And we have to sort of remember too, pre-literate cultures were able to read symbolism very well. I mean, people may not have learned letters, but if you go to Europe to this day and you go to a cathedral, people explain like, oh, people would have known that this statue represents Saint so and so, and this statue Saint, and they just knew by the postures that they held, certain motifs, and that would sort of like let you know who was being talked about and what different poses meant. So I think the ancients did, like, there's always this idea that they're very ignorant, but it just, there's a difference between literacy and just not being educated. And I think people did have a very decent understanding of symbolism. I just wanted to throw that in. Interestingly enough, it should be no surprise then, it sort of makes this whole serpent going up the obelisk or gnomon there, even more profoundly significant. Right? So we can sort of see that entwining that'll come about. Next to it here, you'll see that there's this figure. This is called the Aeon inside this circle. Now, of course, with everything we're looking at with the Ophanum wheels, we're looking at how it relates to a UFO, the spinning nature of a UFO. And that's where we're also going to get into, and Pierre does it through the language in terms of looking at comparing the Greek, the Arabic, Latin, Akkadian, all of these languages, especially the idea too that shields, you have the shield is a big one as well. So you have the shield, which is I think a thuros, which is also a missile, which sort of describes the nature of how it moves, like the shields would be used as missiles in ancient warfare. We'll see that the shield is a huge representation as well of the what Pierre calls the Ophanum wheels, which are what the prophet Ezekiel is describing in the Apocrypha. You see that you have these quadriga in the sky on the left, and the biga, the two animal one on the right. The one on the left is supposed to be Venus in the morning as the morning star, and the one on the right is the evening star. Yet when you actually start to break it down, you see that this is actually the same one. Venus and the morning star, well, one of the reasons that Venus is sort of attributed to Sirius is that Venus is the only thing that goes before Venus in the morning is Sirius rises before Venus, and then Venus follows Sirius before the sun's rising in the day. So we do see a very strong appellation towards Venus, which is also a signifier for Sirius. And going down, you see that there are these young soldiers called the Corybantes dancing around with their shields and their swords. Of course, the sword sort of being representational of the cherubim traditionally. But if you look at these shields, and you, just for a moment, you replace the word, you don't just see shields here, but looking at them as UFOs, we sort of see an interesting picture emerge, especially if we're looking at the chariot representing a UFO as well, an Ophanum wheel. We start to see this whole scene as sort of abundant in references to those vehicles. So yeah, so we have these Corybantes, and their whole dance that they would do is warlike Pyrrhic dance, and it was called they would dance to it. They called it an orgiastic frenzy as they went through the streets, and they were often accompanied by the woman who's in this carriage here, named Cybele. So you have Cybele is this woman here. This is the very ancient goddess that goes right back to Anatolia and will later get adopted by the Persians in the Zoroastrian cult and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's also difficult with this because we're looking at separation of different cultures over different millennia, but all interfusing and relaying the same themes. As Pierre shows in his work, Cybele, when you break down the language, can turn into Zib-Ella, which is meaning the high wolf, or the wolf god. And the wolf, as he describes as well, is appertaining to the dog star, which is, again, Sirius. We see that she's representing the seraphic component, and I won't bother with her consort Attis at this time, but we see that there's the lions. And again, when you had the talk with Pierre earlier about the lions are representing the more of the mammalian lineage, which is going to appertain to the cherubim. So we see the snake and the lion often conjoined, which is discussing the components of these two types of angels that are mixed with the earth hominid to create modern man. So that in itself, you could be like, well, that's a little bit of like interpretation on top of interpretation. But again, if we come back down here to this for the moment, we see that there's these children. And again, we see a bundle of wheat tied together as the first child is carrying. So again, sort of this conjoining, if we're looking at the DNA strand, the combining of the different DNA. We see the other is holding grapes in his hand. Again, we talked about the grapes. The lamb over the shoulders here, more of the mammalian line. And very interestingly, and this is what I love about it, you see here this branch or a small tree represents a twig. And Pierre points out how a twig is in Greek named clone, K-L-O-N. So we're looking at literally here a clone. And this is, again, just a casual interpretation. We're going to see for a moment that it actually does represent a clone, that there was a cloning process that took place. Okay. Sort of to appreciate the rest of this for a moment, I'm just going to quickly jump to something I only found a couple of weeks ago as I was working on this puzzle. I was looking up these components and I found this great visual database. And one of the things that helped me see when I looked up the Aeon, that figure that was in the circle next to the obelisk with the snake, I came up with this, which is showing somebody very distinctive. We see again the lion and the angelic wings and a snake wrapping around this lion. And there's a name for this being. There's multiple examples of the same thing occurring through different artworks that have these different artifacts. And I just think it's really neat because we can look at like sort of the words and the etymologies, and he gives lots of great visual examples. But I think it's really fun to test the theory
Yes.
through real life practical examples. This is a scene of other what's known as the Aeon. So I found this great website that has all of these classical images, and if you see the Aeon here, it's the same one that we were seeing in the plate.
Yes.
So I'm just gonna zoom on that one, and you'll see that the same Aeon is, we have the same figure
Yes.
and the same woman, the same cherubs, and the images around this circle that the Aeon is in is that's the zodiac. So there's a whole other level of like we could be looking at is astronomy, but as well, like you pointed out with the lizard, we look at, you were saying the mantis and the salamander. I think we're actually looking at, if we look at the zodiac, or zodiac, right? It's all based on the different animals. We're actually looking at maybe quite a bit of different types of genetic engineering. Why do I say this? Well, it's quite interesting that the one, and when I saw this, I nearly flipped out, but you can see that there's this figure here. I have a better quality image of it,
Oh
but
my
this will suit
goodness.
for now.
Yes.
Hmm? So we see again the lion and the snake. When we get in on the details, you'll see on the lion's body, there's actually the zodiacal signs, like the Cancer, the crab, and everything else on the body. It's standing on the earth. And again, you can't see it in this photo, but I'll find one that does. And you'll see that the snake is on top of the head.
Yes.
And Pierre's showing the domination of the seraphim over the cherubim, but the genetic fusion that took place. Now, again, as Pierre says, this doesn't mean that we're leaving out the other alien races in that, but this is it's a simplification to try to explain a core concept, right, between two major parts.
Yeah, yeah. Just if I could just interject for a second, the
Please,
cosmological
yeah,
lore that a lot of alien abductees, contactees are familiar with is the lion beings and other feline beings And one can find more information about this in Murray Hope's books. She wrote 2 or 3 good books, and she herself was a lion being shapeshifter. And
Okay.
I've known people who've shapeshifted into lion beings right in front of me.
Hmm.
So you have that element and the lore
Hmm.
of the Lyrans going back to the star system of Lyra is that they were genetic engineers as well. They
Hmm.
went around the cosmos and they seeded they probably did something similar where they took an existing hominoid or hominid on a given planet, infused their lion and other DNA into it to upgrade and enhance these beings into some kind of hybrid variant of themselves. And there's been a long-standing conflict between the Lyrans and some of the Palladians that followed them with the serpent beings, with the lizard beings. This is well embedded not only in the lore, but this is what people have described. People have described, uh, the lions as being warrior beings in conflict with the lizard, saurian, snake beings. It's well embedded and well known in the field that these beings do exist. So please continue. Oh, and
Yeah,
one other
exactly.
thing,
And an easy,
there's the Heidelberg
yeah.
statuettes where these 30,000-year-old dated about 30,000 years, something like that, of these upright lion beings. And you can also see in Graham Hancock's book his illustrations and photographs of all these cave paintings that showed lion beings, that showed mantis beings, that showed shape-shifting from one being into another and being seemingly coming out of portals. Okay.
Oh, that's so great. And even when you just said portal there, it sort of gave a whole new feeling to what this is, what the Aeon is standing in, rather than just a circle. We're actually maybe looking at a portal of sorts as well. But yeah, and Pierre again too, right? Like exactly what you said. And we're looking at the Lyrans, and we have the lion. The homophone similar to it is Orion. So the lions from Orion, and then we clearly see the Sirius beings that go with it, right? Again, we see the demiurge through all of this. So this is known as the demiurge. It goes into the Mithraism and that. So the demiurge, meaning, and Pierre explains us how it's the public craftsman. Public craftsman of what? Of this builder who was a genetic engineer. And that's why we see he's always holding keys in the hand on either side. And the keys also being symbolic of the Ophanim because it's a cog or a wheel and turning a wheel. And we have the whole idea about doors, the doors to the mysteries, right? The Pope is the door to the mysteries. We have the cardinals on the door, and you have the key, which opens the door to the mysteries. When you look at St. Peter's Square, you have the key. The key is also a key, as in Quay, which is a place where the boats are talking again, the illusions of the boats with shields, with UFOs. All of these symbols are interconnected with each other. I'm going to stop this one for a second and just sort of labor this point a little bit further, if you don't mind, just because I find the symbolism, when it reinforces itself, is what makes it even more interesting. So we see just one final example of the Aeon in the examples here. And you'll notice that, again, we have Stabell, the woman that we saw in the chariot, featured here. And here is the Aeon in the middle, along with a Roman guard with the shield on the side. Again, the shield representing, we have Theros, Theos, Theos being God, Theros being shield, all of these words related in the Greek. To me, I just have a very strong feeling with this, and this is the tie-in that I want to do with the Brandenburg Gate relief. To me, it has a very strong feeling of Lucifer. I don't know why it doesn't invoke anything other than that. You'll notice too that he has a globe in his hand, and of course the snake around it as well. So again, this sort of combination, talking about the seraph. So we look at the seraph as the tall beings with the wings, and then it's always contrasted with the mammalian creatures. And Sibel is always seen in her chariot with the lions. And the way I look at it, and to sort of like break down the symbolism a bit further, I find it interesting that the mammal is looked at as a beast of burden. And when we're looking at we're looking at the seraphic host, I think it's really interesting that mankind is used as this beast of burden for the benefit and ease of the seraphim. I think that really can't be underscored enough in terms of looking at what the relationship is. And again, with the wine and the grafting of the species as a parasitic host, it's parasitism that's and grafted itself into our being for the purposes of exploiting our being.
And
Yeah,
just a quick comment about the previous uh, image that showed the winged lion
sorry, yeah,
being with the coiled serpent going completely to
yes.
the top, and then its serpent head on top of the lion head, similar to the Middle Kingdom headdress in ancient Egypt, where you had the the cobra on top of the headdress. To me, and this is just my intuitive feeling, the
Mhm,
serpent above the lion head signifies that we, the reptilians, the saurian beings, have asserted control on this planet,
mhm,
and we managed to do it at the expense of our longtime foes, the lion beings. We've taken some of their DNA even and managed to infuse it into this hominid creation of ours, this uh, hybrid, for lack of a better term. And so it's almost like a neener
exactly.
neener moment, kind of like this is what we did, at the expense of our
100%.
longtime
And
mortal
that's
enemies.
precisely. And that's I think that's really exciting because a lot of people, I think if they haven't had experiences with beings like reptilians themselves, I understand it's a hard sell. I mean, it's really out there in terms of people's connection. I think something like the Greys a little bit easier. But you get into the reptilian domination of planet Earth, it seems a little strange. And it sort of ties in. And I know this. I know if you're coming on the first hour, whatever we need to break, that's fine. But I wanted to show this quickly.
Yeah, we'll
So
go
the
for another few
next,
minutes. Please continue.
yeah, so the next one here, and I hope it's, I hope it's going with the intention of what you had for us to do today. I know there's a whole other angle to their work. And to me, it's to try to complement the hard work that they've done and not just, I think a lot of people love the work and then they're sort of like, wow, that's great stuff, but um, not sure how to proceed with it or how to apply it. And I think that's um, really important, even in exercising our own understanding, because that's when we were like, oh, I don't think I really understand this idea well. The next part, I don't know if it came through
Yeah, I
correctly
see it.
here. We're looking at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, which is, of course, famous as a world monument, one of the seven modern wonders. I was able to see it briefly when I was on the train in Berlin, uh, but I didn't actually get to go up close. Again, we're looking at this quadriga, and I'm just going to pull out some of the things just because I know in Pierre's work, he basically says you have Rakeb, which is a chariot. He's looking at it through the Arabic. Rakab means to ride. Rakaba, one who watches. Kab, a coil. Heb, a serpent. Kaba, to hide. Bilapical of Jana, to conceal, otherwise a jinn. Kabar, to inform. And then it goes into Kabar, the son of a star, and Kabir, a lordship.
Mm.
Okay, so there's this whole relationship between the words and themselves. So Rakeb, a chariot, and Keb, a serpent, is repeated in English polyglottal pun of pun, a saucer, and Soros, a lizard. And
Did you say
I
Soros?
think
And how would that be spelled phonetically in converted to English?
Sauros.
Okay,
Yeah,
so kind
so
of like,
Sauros.
isn't it interesting that one of
Right.
our main nemesis who keeps stirring up all this trouble is a guy named George Soros, and his name is spelled a little differently, but it's, you might as well spell it Sauros,
Ah, mhm.
right?
Exactly. What's fascinating with this stuff is isn't just like, oh, it's you're sort of how did this stuff emerge? Like I was even watching that film, The Atom Project, after this. I don't know if you saw that with Ryan Gosling or whatever his name
Yeah.
is. But it's interesting. It's a film about time travel, right? And he's escaping. And so he goes back in time. The man is named Adam. And again, look at the stuff with Pierre, Adam, coming from Mars, the destruction on Mars, being taken to the moon, and then being planted upon the Earth, right? There's that whole link. But interestingly enough, the main antagonist in the film is this woman from the future that his future self works with. And do you know what her name is? Thorian.
And for our
It comes
purposes,
later through.
yeah, for our purposes, what does that name mean and signify?
Right. That we're looking at the reptilians, right? And she's literally this diabolical character with an antagonist with Adam. She's chasing him through time because she's trying to control the time continuum, right? And a spaceship chasing him. So we have the lizard on the ship or the chariot chasing Adam, and it's right there in a contemporary film as well. It's fascinating to see how this stuff actually replicates itself throughout societies and through time.
Well, it's
So
part
I
of
just
that
wanted to
note.
throw that in.
Yeah, it's part of that uh, body of knowledge that's been passed on to initiates, and they're able to depict the same symbols, motifs, uh, concepts, but in a more
Mhm.
updated way that uh, can be assimilated more readily by the masses. Because if you were to show this to some millennial or some, college kid, the Brandenburg Gate, and even the term Brandenburg Gate or Brandenburg Tor represents some kind of an opening or conduit or passageway, right? It's more than just a literal gate to walk through here on terra firma. There's some deep underlying meaning to that.
Yeah, and it's actually a replica. They chose a Greek uh, style rather than the L'Arc de Triomphe is different. That's not working with the same type of gate, but uh, it relates to the Propyphilia in ancient Greece. So it's actually the entrance to the temple in Athens. So this is actually a replica of the entrance to a critical temple in Greek culture.
Uh-huh.
So we see the religious combination coming through it as well.
And usually Greek
But yeah,
temples were associated or uh, put together in honor or veneration of a particular god or gods in the Olympian
mhm,
pantheon, the Greek pantheon.
exactly. And Pierre's work, like I know we're just doing holographic culture today, but if you go into Murder of Reality, he really gets into the classical stuff really well, the Egyptian, the Greek, and that, especially how it relates to things like human sacrifice. And you sort of see that whole relationship with the gods and whatnot as well. So that I think a lot of people pay attention to this quadriga. So quad, of course, is four. The quadriga being the four horses. And of course, we know in the Bible too, you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse and whatnot. But I like this idea of the horse. It was something I was working on a long time ago, trying to create a model of history that incorporated the occult, because I think humanity is being blind through this whole thing. If you look at horses with the blinders, they're only able to see what you
Yes.
want them to see. And it's sort of like the reptilians, the seraphim, have been this host that have been sort of riding upon us to make their journey easier through the continuum and using us as a type of beast of burden, but it's sort of a conjoined relationship. And we really see that when we go to the bas relief here. So this is beautiful. And again, I think this is something most people would ignore. But what I'd like people to keep in mind as they look through this, again, what we talked about earlier about the seraphim for the tall beings, the cherubim, the shorter angelic cherubs, and conjoining them, as well as what we know that we look at the work with Morrow, Buglino, and Paul Wallace, we're clearly seeing that there was not just aliens coming, but that they were sharing advanced knowledge as well. And this is where we get our notions in mathematics, accounting, law, metallurgy, and warfare. All of these things sort of come together. And in the Masonic myths, you get it with the whole thing of Hiram Abiff and Tubal Cain, right? You have this whole Tubal Cain and Lucifer. There's a very strong connection between Tubal Cain being Lucifer and sort of liberating mankind with this knowledge. So it's complex, and I don't want to just put it sort of the historical way we look at it, but we see that anyway. I'm going to quickly try to go through this as fast as I can, but we start with almost this astronomy on the leftmost figure.
You mentioned Venus earlier, and also the connection with Lucifer, Seth, Sothis, Sirius, Shaitan, Satan, and
Right.
associated with Lucifer. Lucifer being associated with Venus, the rising star. But like you pointed out, Sirius precedes the rising of Venus, right? So, and there's a whole cosmology about that. But for our purposes here, or in some traditions, again, Lucifer is associated with Venus, the rising sun, rising star.
Exactly. And and I don't want to like, because we normally look at it such a negative. I just tried to take a very objective stance with
Yes,
it. But, because it's very easy to get emotional and start polarizing it according to the historical baggage that Christianity typically draws it as. And I think that does a disservice when we're looking at the symbols,
yes.
but I
It
generally
blinds
agree.
people. The dogma blinds people to the point
Yeah,
where they have an emotional reaction of revulsion, where they don't even want this information because whatever is working through
yeah,
them, whatever program they've been subjected to, screams inside of them that they don't want anything to do with this.
yeah, exactly. But quickly here you see we have the harp, uh, and Pierre talks a lot about the Pythagorean monochord, but music is very important, right, in terms of in the occult, because we understand that sound is the primary creation force. And when we're coming into physical matter, it starts with sound.
Yes,
We have the
harmonics,
Aborigines with
sound.
the,
Yes,
so this is very important. We have Mars, the god of war, next. We have a cherubim playing an instrument right next to the music. It looks like we have Vulcan here with the hammer. We notice that we have a cherubim here, a cherubim uh, next to them, and holding up a square. And the square here is, I think, representing uh, Pierre talks with the seraphim. You have Pythagoras and the Pythagorean cult, but the human side, Euclid, you have Euclidean geometry. So I think that's what this is alluding to right here, that the Euclidean geometry over the book. I don't know if you see that,
yeah, I
but
see
it
that.
comes in right there. Interestingly, you see one of the taller beings here kneeling and making themselves equal to the cherubim. And I think this part of it is talking about the fusion of the species and how it's lowered. And you see that the countenance is sort of softened on that being when he's doing it. You also notice that we have a cornucopia again, coming from the next being on the right, standing up above them, and with the fruit. And that cornucopia is also related to Tellus, which is that woman that was reclined with the snake going through her on the other plate. Uh, One of her other symbols, though, besides I looked at the cornucopia, is a bunch of flowers. So this same cornucopia is representing the conjoining of these two species, which is then raised up almost like a child. So if you look at how she's
Yes.
holding these flowers, how
Yes.
you'd hold up like an infant that you're proud of. So this is representing like this new hybridization. And if you see it here, it's amazing. So we see a seraphim again in a quadriga that's being pulled by these mammals, these caribs, these
Yes.
cherubs.
They've
And
become a
what
beast
is
of
what
burden.
is
Yes.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then we see that the figure in the chariot is holding a wreath, but the wreath is what? It's sort of like a woven aspect, right? So this is again the weaving of the genetics. Again,
Intertwining.
talks about this intertwining. This is why we have Moses being taken from the river in weaving, is signifying the weaving of the bloodlines. And not just a happenstance. We see the next image is what? Flowers going around this pole as well with this next figure. Little cherubim are pulling the quadriga, and what's next to it? Oh, that's right, nice fasces. The
Yes.
next seraphim is carrying. Again, the bundling of sticks, right? Conjoining them. And this sort of, it just changes everything, right? Like, look at how we look at the Romans,
Yes.
right? Because they have the fasces. This is where it starts from, right? Mussolini and fascism, right? This is the fasces. So when we're talking about it, we know it's as well a sort of a brutal dictatorial system. Again, you also have the fasces in the U.S. Capitol near the speaker on
Yes.
either
Either
side,
side
right?
of the speaker of the house of the speaker. Yes. Well, hold
So
that thought.
letting you know through the symbols. Yeah,
They are.
please.
Hold that thought. Let's take a break right now because it's been a fascinating
Yeah,
first
sure.
segment. And to our dear listeners, if you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to the cosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.